How do you turn rucking from something that just feels hard into a tool that actually makes you calmer, tougher, and more capable under pressure? The answer isn't going faster or carrying more weight. Sure, that has something to do with it, but it really boils down to understanding how controlled discomfort builds stress tolerance, decision-making, operations command, and author of Tough Rugged Bastards. We break down how rucking develops grit, mental toughness, stress resilience, and clarity. You're listening to the Rucker's Edge podcast, a show all about rucking that is designed to help you improve your rucking routine, lose weight, and ultimately gain your strength and energy back. Each episode dives into the science, stories, and strategies behind rucking. You'll learn from top ruckers, coaches, health experts, and performance specialists who break down what it takes to train smarter, recover faster, and stay ready for the next challenge. So whether you're new to rucking or an experienced rucker that's already logged hundreds of miles, this is the show for you. I'm your host, Spencer. Thanks for listening in. I was fortunate enough to have John Dailey come on the podcast and share his wisdom from his multiple decades of rucking. I learned a few things, and I think you will too. All right, here's my conversation with John Dailey. John, thanks so much for joining me today on the Rucker's Edge podcast. It's really good to have you here.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
So, I just mentioned before we hit record, I had the opportunity to pick up your book. I really enjoyed it. I think you're an excellent writer. I really felt like I was at those places in those stories with you. So I really enjoyed the book. But a lot of it stems from your involvement with Detachment 1 or Det 1, which was the first Marine Corps unit in the United States military's Special Operations Command. Can you briefly describe to the listener what Det 1 was and your involvement in it? I know that's a loaded question because you wrote a whole book about it.
Absolutely. So I do have to say before we start that my opinions do not reflect the Marine Corps or Special Operations Command or anybody else. The U.S. Special Operations Command started in 1987, and it was kind of an outcome from the failed attempt to rescue American hostages in Iran. And when it was formed, the Marine Corps was invited to participate, but chose not to. And so it wasn't until immediately, shortly post 9/11 that the recognition was, realized that the U.S. was going to need more special operations forces. And this time the Marine Corps was told that, hey, you are going to participate. So the Marine Corps had always had its reconnaissance and force reconnaissance Marines, which were the special operations of the Marine Corps, and that's the units that I grew up in.
Okay.
But in 2003, they were told that you're going to start as a test unit, and that was Detachment 1.
Okay. Now, I have a few rucking related questions. Obviously, this is the Rucker's Edge, so majority of the conversation is going to stem around that. In the book, you mentioned at the onstart of Det 1, your resources were limited in terms of training, building space, you had limited gear, and a lot of uncertainty. But y'all did one thing that you could do to train, and that was rucking. And I'm curious, what did those early rucks look like before equipment arrived and infrastructure was put in place?
So as reconnaissance Marines, it was kind of expected that if you're a plumber, you have, your wrenches and things like that. So if you're a reconnaissance Marine, you have a Alice pack, a large Alice pack. And most of the time modified to kind of suit your tastes with added pockets and zippers and things of that nature. So that's the one thing that we knew that we all had. So we would get up early every Thursday morning for whatever reason. On Thursday, would be driven out to a location on base, dropped off, and it was about a 20-mile ruck back to camp. And we would do that the first probably 15 or 16 miles together, moving together. And then the last portion, we would kind of be turned loose into our teams, and it was a race at that point. But yeah, from a lot of hills out in Camp Pendleton, we would ruck with 45 pounds of dry weight and expectation that you maintain at least a 15-minute pace.
Wow. Okay, so you said Camp Pendleton. Where's that located?
That's in California on the coast.
Okay, very
It's
cool.
between San Diego and LA.
Okay, I see. Yeah, so 45 pounds, you said 20 miles every Thursday. Yeah, it sounds pretty rigorous. That's a lot
Was.
to say the least.
Yeah, Yeah, particularly for, we had some when we were formed, they pulled some Marines from the East Coast, out here in North Carolina where it's really flat. So the hills were definitely, those of us who had grown up out there, spent time out there, were definitely at an advantage. But even most of us, were rucking was really not something that you did for pleasure, right? It was
Hmm.
something that you did in preparation for, a selection type of event, or it was done, during your job. So,
Right.
it was pretty rare to see somebody out just rucking, for the sake of rucking.
Right. And I imagine the 45 pounds, what weight were you using? I'm guessing you're using practical equipment that you would need when you're deployed. Is that accurate, or were you stuffing bags with sand and whatnot?
Yeah, sandbags usually just because it was, again, we didn't have a lot of,
Hmm.
regular equipment, and just so the kind of the load would set better. The Alice pack, if you've never used one, has inside of it sewn up high up against the back a pouch that was designed to hold radios, like large high frequency radios or
Hmm.
very, very high frequency, and perfect size for putting a sandbag in to keep it high and tight up against your back. So that's what a lot of us would use.
Yeah, my buddy Mark that got me into rucking, he has well, I guess he had an Alice pack. He was pretty distraught recently when he found out that the frame was starting to rust and it eventually failed on him. So he had to
Mhm.
wear a purpose-built rucksack instead of an Alice pack. But yeah, that thing was very dependable for him for several years. Now they make these things called Alice packs, if I remember correctly. I don't know much about them, but they're pretty much like souped up Alice packs. And someone had mentioned that they're kind of hard to get to unless you're still active duty. I don't know. I don't know if that's
Mhm.
been your experience or not, but you're still involved with the military though, so maybe not.
Yeah, they're tough. They're becoming tougher to come by. So the actual ones they were put into service in Vietnam and lasted through the mainstream military, probably up into the early 90s. And within special operations, they're still used a lot. But there are some companies that make, civilianized versions or
Mm-hmm.
aftermarket versions, and you can get, so I will buy them whenever I find one, for sale on Facebook, or if I find one in good shape at a reasonable price. And the frames are kind of it's a great frame, but it is kind of the weak point.
Oh, so that's a common thing. Good to know. Okay. So using the rucksack to train prior to equipment arriving, what did rucking give you that, access to gyms or pools or even obstacle courses? What did rucking give you that those could not at that stage or the early infancy of Det 1?
Absolutely. We did have access to, obstacle courses, and we would often use those in conjunction. We would still go to the pool, go to the gym, but with
Okay.
I think, a solid foundation of rucking. What rucking will do, and anybody that's done it for any length of time knows that it absolutely develops the mental toughness, mental hardness, that resilience, by going further than you've done before. The gym, it's hard to replicate that. I think in the pool you probably can, but something like an obstacle course, you go climb a rope so many times until you can't climb it anymore. When you're rucking, you can always get back up and continue.
Yeah. I gotcha. And maybe I'm misremembering. I think maybe when you were setting up or starting the individual training course, ITC, maybe that's when you were limited on resources for training. Am I getting that mixed up? Were y'all limited on resources for Det 1 and ITC or just ITC?
Det one, we were absolutely limited, and that's where we were doing the long rucks. I
Okay.
mean,
Okay.
when I said resource, like, we didn't have weapons at that point. We didn't have buildings to actually work out of
I
for
see.
a lot of it, and then other, like, communication equipment, radios, and things of that nature. There were. It did take a while when MARSOC was starting for all of that, for all of that equipment to start coming in as well. But at
Okay.
that one, we were certainly more limited for a longer period of time.
I see. I see. Now, you mentioned mental toughness. I kind of want to get into that I guess aspect of rucking. In the book, you use the term stress inoculation, which I absolutely love.
Mhm.
What does that mean in a training context?
When Marine, a soldier, sailor, anyone, a civilian, when you find yourself in a situation, you cannot train for every situation.
Mm,
Obviously, you know, you can only do so much to prepare. When you find yourself in a situation that's unfamiliar or a situation that has gone bad, you're going to fall back on your ability to manage the stress of that situation. And I think that there's a lot of studies have been done in the brain. There's a portion of the brain called I forget the name of it now, that manages your stress reaction and your stress response. And every time we do something that's harder than we're accustomed to, I call it digging the well, right? We dig our well
hmm
of resilience a little bit deeper. And so when we go to that well, there's going to be water there, there's going to be stress tolerance there. And so the more that and I think rucking is a phenomenal way because anyone, even you and I rucking together, I might reach the point where going beyond my capabilities before you, right?
hmm
But I can carry less weight than you, and so we can level things out where we can keep ourselves at a where we're both, gaining from it, if that makes sense.
Why is discomfort that you choose different from discomfort that's like imposed on you? Or is there? I'm guessing like in terms of training and specifically rucking, you're choosing to do this hard thing. How does that repetitive or routine, load or thinking help you as opposed to like just being stressed all the time? I don't know if that question makes any sense to you. I'm just trying to get to like the root of like what is it about like putting ourselves through this controlled discomfort as opposed to this discomfort that we have no control of.
Yeah, I think both will, eventually kind of do the same thing, right? If I was a child living in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, right, I would become very rugged, right?
Right.
Or I
Yeah.
would die, right? I
Yeah.
wouldn't have food. I wouldn't have, maybe not a home or whatever the case.
Yeah.
That you will either, and then depending on the individual, you will either thrive under that situation and come through it, or you'll give up and die. You know, with something like rucking, I mean, you can quit at any time, and it's not limited to rucking, but
Mhm.
physically hard tasks, something that I can, I don't have to do this. I can drop my ruck, I can go home and lay on the couch.
Right.
But, by choosing to do that, I'm choosing hardship over ease, a life of ease. And, every time I do that, I'm, it's becoming less hard. So
Yeah.
the same workout, a 4 mile ruck that almost killed me, when I started out, it becomes commonplace, and so now it's going to take more to get me to that same point. And so like I said, I'm just digging the well of the reservoir of resolve that I have or of capability that I have that much deeper.
Yeah.
And I feel like rucking is just the perfect, at least in my mind, the perfect medium for that because you have multiple components. You have the load bearing component, you have the kind of cardio component of it, you have the just your feet hurting, blistering, chafing, all the, so many things going on. And you're, well within your kind of purview at any point to be like, hey, I don't want to do this anymore and sit down and call an Uber and go home,
Right. Yeah.
But
That
the
makes
choice not to do that, every single time that that thought crosses your mind and you choose to continue, then you're basically scooping out another big shovel full of dirt, out of the bottom of that well and
yeah.
making it that much deeper and making yourself that much more durable.
Yeah. And you're developing your mental toughness. I think in the book you call it mental toughness on layaway or something like that. Another good term. I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
Now, in the book you mentioned when you were starting the Marine Raider Course or MRC, you said that the special sauce to that training was grit. How do you define grit in a training environment?
I think it's, the one of the somewhat unique things within special operations training is anyone who's going through it is a multiple time volunteer. So they volunteered to join the military, they volunteered to try out for special operations, and then they're, volunteering every minute of every day to continue. So they can stop whenever they want. They can throw in the towel and say, I've quit. So we use the kind of those stress inoculation techniques to develop mental hardness and grit. And I think, different people define it different ways, but really continuing to do something that you don't have to do that's challenging, you know,
Mhm.
continuing to put the Marines into increasingly challenging, not only physically and certainly physically, but also mentally challenging situations, and then requiring them to perform greater, more challenging mental tasks because
Mhm.
you're broke down on the fifth or eighth day of a patrol, walking through the woods of North Carolina in the heat with in many cases, a 85, 90 pound ruck on your back, plus the equipment that's in your vest and pockets and your weapon in your hands. I
Mhm.
mean, quite often they're carrying, upwards of 100, more over 100 pounds. And then
Sure.
you have to think, right? You have to deal with someone, a casualty, when someone goes down. And now, oh, by the way, you've got to, carry their equipment, and it's the middle of the night and you could barely keep your eyes open, but you have to get to a medevac zone to get this, wounded person out. And all of that really pales in comparison to the realities when you find yourself in combat.
Mhm.
So our role is to develop that stress inoculation to the point where we are forcing them, causing them, giving them, I guess, the opportunity to perform incredible feats of strength,
Yeah.
incredible feats of mental kind of acuity and agility and, physical and mental endurance, you know, under situations that hopefully are more challenging than they'll ever actually run into in combat.
Interesting. Yeah. So pretty much mental and physical strength to get the job done, regardless of the conditions, how strenuous they may
Right.
be.
Even when you don't know what those conditions will be or what the job will be.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, a lot of people, civilians, ruck for fitness now, trying to build up their mental and physical toughness. For that civilian rucker, what are the signs that maybe they're actually building grit versus just doing something that sucks or or just suffering? Or are there? Or is it just you're doing it, you're just conditioning yourself unknowingly?
I think there are signs, but I think a lot of times we miss them.
Hmm.
So if you were to, if somebody that just started rucking throws the ruck on, goes out the door, I suspect, within 10 or 15 minutes, you're feeling, hot spot. You're feeling like, why am I doing this? There's all sorts of, questions running through your head, or, is my shoulder broken? Is my back really, really hurts? And maybe I should turn around and call it quits. And there's a fine line between, stupidity, sometimes, and I tend to err towards that on occasion,
Yeah.
and actual, doing an amount that's slightly more than I'm comfortable doing.
Hmm.
And it's really important, I think, when somebody's just starting rucking or any sort of challenging endeavor to, be a little smarter than the average bear and not overdo it to the point where you can't do it the next day. But I think that, probably within a month, that same weight now is, you barely notice that you have it on. Probably after 2 months, when you do get notice a blister coming on, it doesn't cause you to stop and question your life choices, right? You're like, okay, I've had, my feet have hurt before. I know how to deal with it. I know that I will make it through. I'll make it home and I'll take care of the situation. I'll be ready to go again tomorrow. And I think, you know, we if you pay attention, I think you'll notice that you are gaining almost, weekly, you're gaining a level of grit, determination. And then over a longer period of time, I think you'll probably start to recognize in, interpersonal situations or traffic situation. Just, you're probably a little calmer. You're probably able to look at things a little more rationally because the the situation is probably not as bad as the ruck that you did last week, that was longer than you've ever done before, and you ran out
Hmm.
of water and weren't quite sure you were going to make it, you know. So you make it through things that you don't know that you can make it through, then some of life's little petty annoyances become far less important.
That's an excellent way to put that. Yeah, what you said was, if you're starting out, you still need to learn your body. You still need to know what's an issue or what's worth stopping for versus what's pushing through. So through experience, you get to learn your body. You know sort of what your body is capable of, even though you haven't reached that point. You start to develop some confidence that you can push through it. Yeah, and then through daily life, going through situations that will test you, you can draw back on your experiences from that long ruck that you went on over the weekend. I like that a lot. It's a really excellent way to put that. And previously, you mentioned making decisions under stress and how Marines are trained for that. How does fatigue change judgment? And how do, I guess, elite units train Marines to make good decisions while exhausted?
Doing a lot of it is like the best way,
Okay.
but it's so rare now, and the military is an exception, but in modern life, most of us you really, I mean, we may be fatigued, but it's probably our own doing because we stayed up late watching a movie, or we whatever, drank too much caffeine and couldn't sleep.
Hmm.
Most of us are not, especially somebody who's rucking for fitness, probably has enough food to eat. They have a roof over their head. They can, have warm clothes if it's cold, and can go inside if it's hot, have it with an air conditioner. So we're not, or to have a car to actually get to the places if we want to. So we're not, certainly under the constraints that our forefathers were 100 years ago. Most of
Hmm.
us don't have to walk more than, I mean, most people do not walk more than 200 steps a day. That's,
That's wild. Yeah.
it's wild. So
I was just
I
out
think
for my job. I have to occasionally visit a few sites in the South, and I'm on my feet for extended amounts of time. And I think it was like right before noon. My watch gave me alert like, "Oh, you've already hit your goal for the day at 8,300 steps." I was like, "What? It's not even lunch yet." I got back at the end of the day. I had like 1,600 or 16,000 steps or something ridiculous. But I agree with that last thing you said. Is like people need to 200 steps. That's crazy. Like people need to start
But
moving some
that's,
more.
yeah, I mean, that's going to the refrigerator and back to the couch, pretty much.
Yeah,
And, we all, once in a while deserve a day where maybe that's all we do.
it's your
But,
reward. Yeah.
the, I think if we don't want to be that person, and that's the reason that a lot of people get into rucking, because they're like, hey, I'm the trajectory that I'm on is going to take me down a road that I don't want to be if I don't start to do something about it. And rucking is a great way to get obviously a full body workout and cardio and everything kind of included. But we have to choose discomfort. It's most of us will not be in a situation where discomfort's thrust upon us. And the things that the times when we're like, well, I had discomfort thrust upon me. It's, our Coke wasn't cold enough, or our hamburger wasn't, well done enough, whatever the case may be. I mean, they're like real first world sort of problems.
More with John in just a moment, including his explanation of what leading and lagging indicators are and how you can use them to improve your rucking and fitness. But I want to take a quick break to say thanks for listening to the podcast. If you're finding value in this episode, please text it to a fellow rucker that might find it interesting or a friend that could benefit from rucking. Sharing the episode would help the show grow and help more people improve their health and lives. Okay, back to it. Now, I know a lot of this conversation I've drawn from your book, but in addition to your book, you also maintain a few newsletters, one of them being Ruck the F Up, or RTFU. I had the opportunity to read a few of your most recent posts, and I really like the messages that you write about. Recently, one of them was about leading versus lagging measures,
Mm.
and it's kind of like a way to upgrade your mindset is the takeaway that I
Mhm.
had from it. It that really resonated with me. Can you introduce the concept of leading and lagging measures and why one is more important than the other?
Absolutely. So, and it comes from business, right? If at the
Hmm.
end of the quarter, the company's made, I set everybody around the conference table and say, hey, we made 20% increase in sales over the quarter, then that's a lag measure. At that point, when I throw that slide up on the wall, there's nothing that we can do to change that, right? That number on the wall was the product of lead measures. That was the product of people getting on the phone and making more sales calls. It was the product of whatever it was that took, and I'm not a salesman, I don't know, but
Yeah,
that's,
yeah,
took to get there. But for us, a lot of time, particularly, and I wrote that just at the end of last year because a lot of people make New Year's resolutions that, hey, I want to run a marathon or I want to ruck a half marathon or whatever the case may be. And that's the thing that you want to do in 4 months, 6 months, a year is a lag measure. What are the lead measures that will get you there?
hmm
And often it's easy to become like disillusioned or it's hard to find motivation in something that's not going to happen for 6 months. But if I say that the lead measures is that I've got to ruck 3 times a week, I've got to increase my distance, every other week or whatever the case is, I can more easily I can measure those. I either did it, that week at the end, or I didn't. And if I continue to do those things, then the chances are going to exponentially increase that I will hit my lag measure.
yeah. Okay, so I guess it's safe to say leading measure is more of like that's the work that you're putting in to get the result in the lagging
Yeah,
measure.
and that's the reward
Yeah.
essentially, or the failure. If
Right.
you.
Or the inaction. Yeah. Okay. So what are some examples of leading measures that you would care about when training Marine Raiders?
you know, just really putting in the work.
Hmm.
If it's something that we're doing, if my lag measure, I want them to be able to shoot well enough to guarantee that they can bust into a room and shoot bad guys, 100% of the time, when shoot a hostage 0% of the time, then that is going to come from a progression of training that first, hey, can they shoot and hit the target accurately? Then can they, continue to be accurate while we increase the speed? Then can I, have them shoot and distinguish between a bad guy and a hostage target? And then can I put them inside of a house now where they're moving? And then can I do it at night? And so it's a progression of training, just like it is if you're trying to go from, rucking 5 miles to 20 miles. It's
Hmm.
just, what are the things that I need to do and the more that we can break that goal, really, the end goal, the lag measure down into its component parts, then it becomes a lot easier to say, hey, to see that I'm making progress, in a shorter period of time, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm kind of curious. You've been rucking pretty much your entire adult life. You've achieved quite a lot. If a rucker only measured three things to stay on track long term, maybe to achieve some sort of rucking related goal, like maybe rucking a marathon or something like that, what would you think of the three most important ones would be?
Well, I've kind of have two answers to that. I
Okay.
always say that the most important thing, if you're going to unfuck something in your life, the top three are sleep, in order: sleep, nutrition, and your exercise plan.
Hmm.
So, working to make sure that you're adequately rested, because when you're rested is when the muscles are healing and you're getting stronger from whatever it is that you did. The nutrition, if you don't get that right, then you're never going to maximize your potential. But from a training plan perspective, I mean, I think there's really three three big kind of levers that I call them, that you can adjust when rucking, and then a fourth, potentially, and those are how far you're going, how fast you're going, how heavy you're going, and then how high, whether in
Yeah.
elevation. If you have that available, it's kind of hard to come by out here in North Carolina.
Same
But
here in Louisiana.
it, just recognizing that, a lot of times I think people that start rucking, and starting rucking is 1,000 times better than not. All right, or
Hmm.
starting any kind of exercise program, really. But since this is the Rucker's Edge, there's probably a lot of people that listen that maybe were sedentary, and now they're out rucking and they're proud of themselves and they should be. But if you've been going out and doing the same ruck with the same weight, the same distance, and it takes you the same amount of time, month in, month out, then you really ought to say, hey, I've got to start, not trying to address all these things at once, but, what's one thing that I can address? Maybe I don't have more time, but I could go a little bit faster
Hmm.
and try to finish a little bit earlier. Or maybe I could add in some more weight and go a little bit shorter,
Yes.
until those. And so you can kind of manipulate those three levers to continue to make sure that you're growing. And if you have access to the fourth, and everyone, you can find a parking garage. I do that sometimes. There are some hills, a 5 or 6 hour drive that I'll go head up once in a while. But,
Cool.
just constantly thinking if I've, as with anything, if you work out in the gym and you all you do is show up and do the exact same exercises, the same number of sets and reps with the same amount of weight, then I mean you're doing something for yourself. That's good, but you're not improving. Right? You're kind of becoming stagnant.
Hmm.
So you've got to throw more weight on the bar. You got to throw more weight in the ruck or go a little bit faster to continue to build. And that's I see quite a few people that I work with that have to get sometimes like a little swift kick to to pull themselves out of the comfort zone that they get
Sure.
in.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I mean, yes, they're doing something that they weren't doing before. They're doing something that's challenging, and they're doing something that maybe their friends, would never dream of doing or couldn't do. But you got a lot more in you than you're capable of a lot more.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. I really appreciate you offering that up to the listener. I kind of want to move on to the mental aspect of rucking. Again, we talked about kind of grittiness previously, but I also want to talk about how it can help with our mental state and clarity. You said in the book that you use rucking as a form of meditation. How are you using rucking to meditate? I guess do you go out with certain prompts, or do you just go out with a clear head and just see what thoughts pop into your head and just kind of explore those?
Well, it depends, kind of on the day, on the usually once a week I go out with one of my good friends and we ruck, and that's the function of that ruck is probably 50% social,
Sure.
and fifty
Yeah.
percent. So there's absolute value in that. It's just going out with somebody and worrying less about the pace and the distance. Just you're putting in the work, but you're also making sure that you're taking care of whatever relationship that is. So on those rucks, I mean that's the main focus. 51% of the reason for doing that is to make sure that I'm keeping up with him or keeping up socially. Not I'd crush him if we were to try to race, but if when I do go out, one of the things that I noticed about myself is having spent so long in the Marine Corps, most of my rucking was head down, just going. I was looking at my feet, make sure I didn't trip over everything, but just moving as fast as I can.
Sure.
And there are times when that's absolutely beneficial, but I'll kind of schedule rucks where I do that. Where hey, today I'm going all out. I'm not going to pay attention to my surroundings. I'm not going to try to think any big thoughts. One of the things I've realized, whether it's running or whether it's rucking, if you want to go as fast as you can, as you're capable of, the only thing that you can think about during that entire ruck is going as fast as you can. All right, you got to be like, hey, I'm moving my legs as fast as I can. Am I swinging my arms right? Am I doing everything that's going to move me forward? And there's value in that. That's building mental toughness like 101 right there.
Hmm.
But again, going out and having a programmed ruck per week where your goal is I mean, sometimes I kind of focus on noticing my surroundings, picking my head up. And that was kind of a big like prompt for me. Hey, just, look around, like look at nature. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And, sometimes I'll try to either focus, it's on one thought or one, I mean, sometimes it's like one problem that I'm, dealing with. And then sometimes it's trying to kind of clear my mind totally and just, be totally present in the moment.
Very good. Yeah, it's really good advice about if you're rucking for a specific goal in mind to when you're out on your rucks, because I am definitely guilty of this, is to stay focused and stay on target. It's really crazy to me. Rucking's one of the only exercises that I think I can recall where my mind will just drift into some thought or that I haven't thought about in a while, or just distract me from physically
Mm-hmm.
achieving. But and sometimes I explore it. I'm like, okay, maybe I need to start thinking about this. Let's take this time to actually do some thought or put some thought into this next action that I have to take in my life as opposed to my physical wellness. But I'll catch up with my physical wellness next time. But you're
Yeah, and I
absolutely
think
right. Stay focused.
there's absolutely value in all of those things. Whether
Hmm.
it's going slower because you're going with a friend that you want to catch up with, or whether it's letting your mind kind of wander. There's value in
Hmm.
that. But if you, and I think a lot of people just default to that setting where, hey, I'm just gonna
Hmm.
throw the ruck on and I'm just gonna walk and not pay attention to how fast I'm going, how far I'm going. Just
Yeah.
there's should be a in running, if you were to, and I used to for a while got into running like crazy 100-mile races, and you train to build up to that. You build what's called a periodized program, right? And so you spend, and that's kind of what I'm talking about in the RTFU Substack the newsletter over the next month or so. Is the first phase of that is building a base building. So you just getting in more miles than you're used to, smartly growing the essentially the depth of your well, your physical fitness.
Hmm.
And then once you have that, then you have, a conscious effort that, hey, I'm going to now switch to, speed, or maybe I'm going to switch to adding weight, all everything that's the stepping stones are going to take me to the lag measure, the race that I have down the road. At some point I'm going to say, hey, I know that the event that I want to do is in the mountains, so I'm going to have to start doing specific training for that.
Hmm.
Maybe that means going on the stairmaster or the a stair stepper or something at the gym because you don't have the you know. So it's we should really look at our rucking training program like a runner looks at theirs. We should say that,
Yeah.
hey, on Tuesday, I'm going out and doing, like a mile warm up, a couple miles fast. Next week on Tuesday, I'm going to slow down a little bit, but I'm adding 5 pounds.
Hmm.
And then, Thursday, I'm going to do some intervals or whatever the case is. But if we think, I mean, one, think of ourselves as athletes, you
Yeah.
know, two, then, treat ourselves the way that athletes, treat themselves, think of ourselves the way that they do and train ourselves the way that we do.
Oh,
And that's
absolutely. Yeah.
one of the great things about rucking is that, and I've said this a million times, if I were limited to one exercise that I could do, it would, for the rest of my life, it would be rucking. But I'm not, right? So,
Yeah.
we can, use the gym, and one of the great things is it's another, newsletter that's coming out pretty soon. In lieu of a gym, with just the ruck that we have, we can use that to do a lot of the movements that, a weight bearing kind of movements that rucking doesn't necessarily address.
That's excellent.
Largely like squatting,
Hmm.
hinging, those we can do, deadlift kind of lifts we can do with our ruck. And then like pressing, we can do some push-ups or press overhead. We can lift, press our ruck overhead,
Yeah.
drag type of things. You can use a ruck to hit every, muscle group and every kind of movement modality to make sure that you're, staying as well rounded as possible. If you're
Excellent.
somebody that doesn't want to go to the gym or doesn't have the time or the access or something like that. But I would
Yeah.
definitely, think we should look kind of big picture, rucking in a best case scenario, rucking is a component of a broader fitness program. Some rucking, some gym time, some running, some swimming, whatever it is that you can do.
Agreed. Yeah, I think it's here in Louisiana, we have a term called lanyap, and that just means extra. I think rucking is the
Yeah.
perfect lanyap for any exercise routine or fitness plan you're on. I totally agree with that. You just mentioned your RTFU newsletter again. Before we close out, I wanted to talk to you about that. So, what was your drive or purpose for starting that newsletter, and who is it for?
So it was, I had started earlier than that, the other newsletter that's called Walking Point. And I wrote a series in the Walking Point newsletter on rucking, and there was just a pretty big response to it. So I decided to, have an offshoot, like a sequel, and started 2 years ago. RTFU is a weekly newsletter, and I initially thought it would be a lot of young people preparing for special operations selection. And what I've come to find out is it's mostly men, probably 85% men, but there's quite a few women as well. Mostly like 40 to 60 or more that, are just in some stage of a lot of former military, but a lot of people who never served in the military, just using rucking to either, like we said, augment another training program, or to just as a way to get back in shape. And so it's a pretty broad audience, and it's pretty awesome to get to interact with everybody, answer questions, and just kind of talk to them about something I love doing.
Excellent. Yeah, I've been enjoying reading them. I encourage the listener to subscribe. If they do want to subscribe or pick up a copy of your book, where should they go?
So the Amazon is probably the easiest place to buy the book. Most local bookstores have it or could order it. It's called Tough Rugged Bastards from like Simon and Schuster. But the newsletter is rtfu.substack.com, and you can sign up there. And then you can also go to jadailey.com. That's my website, jadailey.com. And that's kind of everything, one-stop shops there.
Excellent. I'll include a link in the show notes for everyone to check out. Well, John, we're going to wrap it up here. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I have a tremendous amount of respect for you. Thank you for serving our nation in the Marine Corps, and thank you for taking the time to have this chat with me today and share your knowledge with the listener, some ruckers out there. Before we go, though, I'm doing something new here. If you were to make a bumper sticker about rucking, what would it say?
It would say, "Life is hard, be harder."
I like that. I like that a lot. Well, again, John, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time.
All right, that wraps up my conversation with John Dailey. In the show notes, I provided links to his book as well as his newsletter, so go check those out. If you want to reach out to me, head on over to theruckersedge.com or on Instagram at theruckersedgepod. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow or subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app so you're notified of new episodes. You're not going to want to miss next week's episode because we sit down with Andrew Brandt. We talk about his fitness journey and how it parallels so many people that get into rucking to improve their fitness. And we talk about the book that he wrote, Weighted Steps, which is a practical guide to rucking. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening to this episode of The Rucker's Edge.